Sense pamphlet relates to the National History Day theme because of the major impact it had among the colonists and how persuasively Paine's thoughts were communicated, making it one of the most persuasive pamphlets during the Revolution. Pamphlets were a major way of reaching others and had an obvious effect on those who read his work.
French colonies, or also known as the American colonies, were established during the 17th and 18th centuries. These colonies, where the eastern United States are now, grew geographically and numerically by the time of the Revolution. The settlement spread beyond the Appalachian Mountains and extended from Maine to the Tanana River in Georgia, with a population of around 2.5 million colonists by the time of the Revolution. Among those colonists was Thomas Paine, born on January 29, 1737, in Thetford, England. Paine's father had high hopes for him. At the age of 12, though, he had failed out of his school. This wasn't the only thing Paine did not thrive in. Paine later was an apprentice for his father and was a tax officer, both of which ended up like the former. Some of Paine's first work came from his job as a tax officer, including the case of officers of excise, arguing for a pay raise and acting as a teaser for what's to come. Paine made his way to Philadelphia through the help of Benjamin Franklin in 1774. In Philadelphia, Paine's career turned to journalism. After the French and Indian War, the British were in great debt, so they began taxing the newly developed colonies as a debt for fighting in the war. On April 5, 1764, the British began taxing the colonies 3 cents on sugar. The tax on other items, including wine, coffee, and indigo, was also increased. This caused anger in the colonies, but was later repealed in 1766. This was known as the Sugar Act. Another tool for fighting in the war was the Stamp Act, passed on March 22, 1765. Great Britain required all colonists to purchase stamps for all documents, newspapers, licenses, and playing cards as well, but the act was later repealed in 1766 as well. This allowed colonists to communicate with others more easily. More taxing occurred in the Townshend Acts, but these were on paint, glass, lead, paper, and the biggest on tea. The colonists then felt as if the British were able to control every aspect of their lives if they were able to control their drinking habits. The colonies continued to deny the taxing ordered by the British. British soldiers resulted to violence in the 1700s and ended up killing 5 men. This was known as the Boston Massacre. After occurrence of the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, and a parliament designed to regain authority in Massachusetts, colonial delegates met on September 1774. George Washington, John and Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Jay made up this group in order to give voice to their grievances toward the British. They did not demand independence from Great Britain, but rejected taxation without representation, and the British Army being in the colonies without their consent. Until Congress also issued a declaration for the rights of every colonist. They had agreed to meet again on May 1775 to discuss the route of the colonies, but the first shots of the Revolution occurred before they were able to. The first shots were fired in Lexington, Massachusetts, on April 19, 1775. About 700 British soldiers were tasked with secret orders to destroy the colony's military supplies. The colonies knew about the risk of their supplies and moved them to different locations long before the British were on the move. They were in the know of the coming engagement with the British Army due to the rise of some brave individuals. At first, they were outnumbered with only 500 men, resulting in the British being able to move to Concord. They still came out empty-handed and allowed the colonists to come back with reinforcements. They met their enemies at the North Bridge in Concord and were able to drive the British back to Boston and block the land access to Charlestown and Boston. This then started the Siege of Boston.
This was not in the mind of many of the American citizens, but the work of Paine made the idea of breaking free from Britain catch on. In 1776, Paine published a pamphlet titled Common Sense. In his writing, Paine claimed that it would be a horrific idea to make peace with Britain and make King George III the ruler of their country. He wrote that their connection with Britain caused them to suffer because of the endless wars they had gotten into. Some of his other arguments for independence was the distance between them and Britain, and that each had different start dates and obvious differences in sizes. As the title states, he argued that it's common sense to stop being ruled over by the king. His work was also communicated to colonists in town meetings when it was read out loud and in newspaper printings. Europe, and not England, is the parent country of America. This new world hath been the asylum for the persecuted lovers of civil and religious liberty from every part of Europe, meaning they are traveling to uncharted territory in order to act on their own religious and civil beliefs. Hither they have fled not from the tender embraces of the mother, but from the cruelty of the monster. In other words, they did not leave because they wanted to. It was because they were fleeing the king. And it is so far true of England that the same tyranny which drove the first immigrants from home pursues their descendants still. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. I believe that the citizens should make the laws of America. His words were very persuasive and changed the views of many Americans. Many people wrote to others about this new pamphlet titled Common Sense, asking if they knew who the author was, since it was first published anonymously. A letter from Maryland states that Paine worked wonders and has converted others to support the revolution. They claim they only knew 3 who weren't supportive of a break from Great Britain. In another letter addressed to the author of Common Sense on March 17, 1776, they claimed that they weren't convinced
They were convinced for the need for independence and had brought liberty to every colonist to contribute to this revolutionary act. Many people were eager for a revolution after reading Paine's pamphlet, but there were still some who weren't convinced. A man who seemed dangerous and toxic in the eyes of those who disagreed with him. One of those people was James Chalmers, who made his own pamphlet titled Plain Truth that was published in 1776. The author of Plain Truth was debated for a while before they found enough evidence to deem the author as James Chalmers. Paine and Chalmers were old enemies, and this was obvious in the pamphlet. There were many loyalists who disagreed with the statements of Paine, who stated that the monarchy that was Great Britain had no right to rule over America. The pamphlet was for the other side, towards reconciliation with the British. Chalmers wrote about how it was ridiculous for Paine to suggest that he was speaking the commonly held view of the colonists, or speaking based on good judgment. He also stated that Paine's position was an example of quackery, and wasn't an accurate representation of common sense. But Chalmers made one major mistake in his pamphlet. This was the vocabulary in which he wrote his work. Paine had made the wise choice and wrote in the plainest way possible, so every colonist was able to understand his thoughts and opinions over the war. Chalmers had done the opposite and referenced many other works of writing. The simple colonists wouldn't even attempt to read his work, and those were the ones who needed convincing. Those who had gotten a high education were already loyalists and shared the same feelings. One of his reasons for siding with Great Britain was their constitution. With all its imperfections, the English Constitution is and will ever be the pride of envy and of mankind. James Chalmers' Plain Truth. The American Constitution had not yet been made during the publishing of Plain Truth, so that argument is what most loyalists used to push for reconciliation with Britain. Those like John Adams knew that America needed politicians, not mob leaders, to run their governments. Another one of Chalmers' reasons for going back to Britain's rule was the debt the colonies owed Britain. As the two sides continued their dispute, the Continental Congress voted among themselves for independence. On July 2nd, they voted with 12 delegates favoring the revolution after many delays for the voting. This led the Congress to creating the Declaration of Independence, with its primary author being Thomas Jefferson. After many edits, the document was signed on August 2nd, 1776, by 56 members of the Second Continental Congress. After the siege of Boston, the Revolutionary War for independence for Britain continued for 7 years, with a total of 230 battles. The Battle of Yorktown, which ended in 1781, was the last major battle, but the war didn't end until the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The American Revolution came to an end on September 3rd, 1783, signifying America now its free nation, which was recognized by the British. After the American War had ended, Thomas Paine returned to Europe. He got involved with the French Revolution, and another one of his famous works was written due to that, titled Rights of Man. Not for the common sense pamphlet, the Revolutionary War could have quite possibly have not ended up as we know it. The colony's army was already outnumbered, and without those who were persuaded by Paine's work, those numbers could have been a lot more uneven. This pamphlet was very persuasive among the colonists and communicated the thoughts of a future founding father. Communication impacted the whole Revolutionary War and helped the colonies break free from Britain. Since pamphlet matters to us now because of how great of an impact it had on people in the 1700s and how Paine was able to persuade them with what little communication they had. The most useful ways of communication for the colonists back then were pamphlets and newspapers, while we have television and the internet to get thoughts across to millions of people. If Thomas Paine could get the colonists to help with the American Revolution, our technology can be used to help better our communities. We are using our means of communication to help get across dangerous weather, anything happening with the government, in our relationship with other communities, and this is important. Most of the times the news or messages we get around us are about negative issues in the world around us, and some of those things tend to get us more divided. Paine's words led to the Americans beating Great Britain and helped start this nation we now call our home. We have access to things they could never dream of, and we find ourselves constantly separated. This pamphlet is important because it reminds us of how we can come together as a community.